on the behalf of PaleoTalks team to all for this interesting session of 12th PaleoTalk session. We started in May, if I'm not wrong. And the first idea when we started this whole series of talk is to engage and initiate a dialogue about the evolutionary research, specifically in regard of South Asia. And our intention is to talk about and discuss the story of our own human evolution, and where not only a single individual, not only a single race, not only a single, but every individual is represented in that story, and they can speak their own version. And that's what the story of humanity all stands for. We believe in creating research environment that looks at the researchers as a people, as an individual, with a common goal to tell the story of humanity. We try to encourage and support all different array and different set of paleo researchers coming not only from South Asia, but all different niches of the world and their research, and try to discuss their research, the components and intricacies of research, and talk about it and put it on a wider horizon in front of different set of people. And what we do, we initiate a dialogue about their research, what they do, how they do, and what exactly they look planning to do in the upcoming times, and talk about and get into the intricacies of it, what we call basically peer review. And not only talking about the facts, what they have been talking about and discussing in the research, but also talking about the approaches and the methodology and the model making. And today's session is actually an example of one of the methods, what exactly has potential to open up new horizons in evolution research. And of course, then putting up the research on the platform, this virtual platform, what we intend to do to expand the outreach of the research. And as you see, we don't say the Paleolithic research, we say paleo research, which is a step towards a transdisciplinarity. Here we do not only address the archaeologist or what we call Paleolithic archaeologist, but we also welcome ecologists, people doing research in genes, people doing research in proteomics, people doing research in different kind of scientific fields, which is completely transdisciplinary and which is very much required to do a paleo research. But any of the research is not represented by a single individual, is represented by a team. For doing paleo talks, we also have a team of researchers doing and involved and engaged in paleo research. So we have a team of eight scholars, 4 doctorate candidates, and 1 MPhil and 3 postgraduate scholars. And we always intend to share and initiate a talk about it. And we also want to put up this research on a wider horizon. So every time, so today's the 12th session. And by the time we had at least 40 speakers, around 40 speakers among us, presenting their research, disseminating their research, and talking different components of it. And today, I'm very, very glad to introduce a subject, not introduce a subject, to initiate a conversation about a subject which has a great potentiality. In a way, people have been talking and dealing in this subject in a wider manner in different parts of the world, but specifically in South Asia, we need to explore the more potentiality of it. The subject, what we call traceology, or in a way, synonymously, I say user analysis. In Pleistocene and Holocene, human being has been using tools. I do not want to put lithics, because today's speaker will kill me with that, because tools can be made on multiple set of materials. Yeah. It's not only stones. Of course, fortunately, unfortunately, we get lots of stones, but we also have bones, we have antlers, we also have shells. And what are the implications and interventions of behavioral, how people use these tools? And there from the Stuart Pigott saying, from piecing the past, we are getting to another resolution and more closer resolution, what we call tracing the past. We get into the microscopic perspective to see and understand the human behavior. And that's where traceology comes in the picture. I'm very glad today to have Dr. Lakshmi Tumang with us. She's a research associate, and she's also former IDQP and IMQP scholar, did a master's in quaternary prehistory and also doctorate in quaternary prehistory at IPIS Tarragona, Barcelona, Spain. And she's currently working in Western Iran as a part of doctorate research. She's worked in Khorramabad Valley on Middle Paleolithic, or what we call Mousterian, and Upper Paleolithic assemblages in the region and talked about the functional analysis of these artifacts. So artifacts, I mean not only the lithics, but also the wide variety of material. One of the interesting part about our today's speaker, she also worked on shell. And at this point of time, we have very few researchers. We talked about the utility of shell as a tool. And she published about it not only in terms of archaeological horizon, but she also worked on the proxy building, how a multiple set of material can work and what kind of useware we can see on these materials. I'm very glad, and as a member of PaleoTalks team, we are honored to have you, Dr. Lakshmi, with us. And I now request our speaker to share her presentation, and the whole platform is all yours, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so let's start.
You have to share, yeah.
Got it?
Yeah.
Make it full screen.
Yeah, it's working.
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, good afternoon, everybody. And I want to thank the organizers of PaleoTalk for inviting me for this talk session. And thank you, Gopesh, for such a elaborate and good introduction of me, because you know, sometimes you forget what you have done. So that kind of introduction was really nice to hear. And so as he already said that I have worked on traceology by using shell tools and stone tools. And shell tools was more of my master's thesis, and with the stone tools, it was more in for my PhD thesis. And today's work is basically a combination of both the works. And I don't take more time with this thing, and let's jump into the presentation. So the title of my presentation is Tracing the Past Through Traceology. So the structure of my presentation involves introduction to traceology, because many of you, I don't know whether you know about this field or no. So I want to give you the simple introduction about this field, that what we as a traceologist work in this one, and how the protocol of this traceology we follow in our work to interpret the functionality of the tool, and even the what kind of functions were happened in the archaeological sites. And in this session, I will be focusing more on the methodological issues, because when you have a good methodological protocol with you, you can identify the evidences of past in a much better way. So the first issue is the modern day contamination. Because as a traceologist, if you cannot identify the modern and the archaeological one, you will misinterpret the whole assemblage, and the wrong data will be presented to you. So we should have a data set of modern day contamination, how they occur, why they occur, and how we can eradicate them in the during the whole protocol, so that we interpret our archaeological material with much more authenticity. Apart from there, I also want to emphasize on the multi-analytic approach importance, because if the traceological study, we will only involve one method to analyze the samples, we will not get the holistic view of the whole site, what is happening. So in the multi-analytic approach, I will be talking about different kind of microscopes you use, and with each microscope, how you get the better image of the or identification of the usewares. And for the residue analysis, for the multi-analytic approach, I want to emphasize on the technique of the non-invasive method, because with the non-invasive method, you keep the residues on the lithic surface in situ. And in this way, it helps you sometimes for the further comparative analysis. You don't lose the information with that thing. So we, in my whole PhD thesis, that was the aim, to reinforce that thing, that not to remove the residue from the artifact surface. And in the analytic approach, because the 3D digital microscope is a very new approach which started in traceology. So I had the access of 2 of the 3D digital microscope during my PhD research in EPES department and also in Musée del Homme in Paris. So it gave me an opportunity to assess the feasibility of this particular microscope, whether it is good enough to identify the traces, and if yes, till which extent, and it can be only used alone or can be used as a complementary aspect with the other two main microscope which is used in traceology for a long time is the optical microscope and the scanning electron microscope. And to support all of these results, I will be sharing the results from my PhD, where I have analyzed the stone artifacts from the middle and upper Paleolithic sites of Khorramabad Valley, Western Iran, and specifically concentrating on the Kaldar cave assemblage. So now let's jump into introduction. So first question comes, what is traceology? So if you guys know about it, so it's good, but if you don't know, you don't have to panic. I will tell you right now. So traceology is basically an archaeological discipline which deals with the study of traces in the form of usewares. So usewares you get in the form of maybe some kind of edge fractures, edge chipping, or some kind of polishes, linear striations, edge rounding, or some kind of abrasion on the artifacts. Or else in the form of residues. They can be organic or inorganic. And they are always found on the surface or on the edge of the artifacts. And those artifacts can be made of stone tools, shell tools, bone, antler, or even metal also. And why this traces occurs on the artifacts? Due to certain kind of activities performed by them. So apart from this, like Gopesh already said, this is also referred as like useware analysis also. But apart from that, useware analysis, sometimes it is also referred as functional analysis, residue analysis, or microware analysis. And the father of traceology is Sergei A. Semenov, who was a Russian archaeologist. And his work is very significant for us because he completely changed the way the traceology was done before and gave us a new kind of methodology, which later improved by many traceologists, and we as a new traceologist still are improving that those methods. So let's jump into the history of traceology. So everything started somewhat around mid-19th century to early 20th century. So during that time, in most of the archaeological sites, stone tools were found. So the question for the archaeologists was very intriguing, that why these stone tools are there, how they were made, and what was the function of them. So initially, they were identifying them with the help of their morphology, shape, and size by saying, okay, it looks like a knife, it's a knife, like that way. And sometimes to reinforce or to confirm their results, they were also looking back to the Aboriginal people to look into their tools and what kind of activities they are performing with those tools. They were identifying the tools what we were finding in the archaeological sites. And then with that thing, some few microware analysis was done during this time, but they were mostly was macroscopic. Macroscopic means which you can see through the naked eyes, what is happening on the edges. Maybe some big like fractures is happening, some microchipping is happening. In that way, the microware were identifying. Apart from that, the only thing which was used with some magnifying lenses, some archaeologists were trying to see the edges of the tools. And through that way, the first microware which was identified was sickle gloss. And after this period comes the early 20th century to mid 20th century. This period is very significant because during this time in the Western, among the Western archaeologists, some kind of experimental works were conducting to understand the functionality of the tools, how they were used, maybe for how much duration and all those things. But the methodology by the Western archaeologists was not that, helpful to conduct a good protocol for that thing. But on the other hand, in Russia, Semenov was developing this work with a constructive protocol, experimental protocol, and also involving in that protocol the microscopic analysis, both the low power and the high power magnification microscopes. So he did all this work for 20 years, and he finally published his work in his Russian monograph that is published in 1957. But everything changed when his book got translated in English by M.W. Thompson, and the Western archaeologists came to know about that how you can conduct these kind of traceological study in a much better way to interpret the past activities. His work was mostly to replicate the activities for the stone tools, bone tools, and of ivory. And he was mainly focusing on the linear striations on the modern day tools to compare with the archaeological one to identify the traces. Then comes the period of 1970s to 1980s, which you can say as the user revolution time. Because after the publication of this English translated book of Semenov, many of the Western archaeologists got interested in the traceology. And they, because there was still a little bit of errors in some methodology and all. So Ruth Trigham, along with her two PhD students, George H. Odell and Lawrence Kelly. And there was another PhD student by that time, Johan Commingham. Sorry, I didn't get the photo of him, so I could not able to put. But these are the four people, pioneering one, I can say, who started to develop the work of Semenov much more further. And in that way comes two kind of microscopic approaches. So those two microscopic approaches was low power approach and the high power approach. So now what are these two things? So the low power approach, in this, the analysis was done by using stereoscopic binocular microscope, and the magnification was always less than 100 magnification. However, for the high power approach, non-stereoscopic optical microscope or metallographic microscope was used with the magnification between 100 to 500 magnification. With the low power magnification, the archaeologists were mainly trying to identify the fractures on the tool edges, and they classified them in different categories. And that classification is also known as HOHO classification. But I'm not going to go into too much detail of that thing in this presentation. But the high power approach was concentrated more on the polished formation on the edges to identify them and their use related polish which are they. And with this approach, it was also more beneficial to understand on what kind of worked material. Worked material means like I have a stone tool, whether I'm working on with a wood or on a bone tool, all those things was easy to interpret with this kind of approach. However, the first residue was identified by low power approach. And during that time, the first residue traces were identified were the plant residues, such as phytolates and the, fiber of plants, like that way. But later, to go to the more deeper detail of the things, high power approach was used. And then in that way, the residue analysis also came into picture. But till a long time, it was always considered user analysis and residue analysis as two different fields. But later it was said, no, we should combine both of them, because in that way, we get the proper information about the activity performed by the artifact. And in that way, even the low power and high power approach was having a big conflict for a long time, because the people who were developing the low power one, they were saying it is the best method to apply this approach. And then later in Uppsala conference, it got as a agreement that no, we should combine both the approaches, because in that way it will help for the better interpretation of the user traces. So like that way, it got combined. Then the user and residue analysis got involved in that thing. And by using this method, different kind of raw materials were analyzed. But the shell tool analysis came in a very later picture with a much more intensity to work with that is from 2000 onwards. So during this microscopic analysis, what kind of microscopes were mostly used before and still continuing to use the same way is the optical microscope, then the metallographic microscope, and the scanning electron microscope. From the very beginning till now, this is the three microscopes which is widely used by the traceologist. Along with this, sometimes also use the confocal microscope, which is mostly used for the quantification of the users. And recently, the 3D digital microscope has made its debut to the traceological studies, and I'm going to discuss this thing in my presentation later. So now question comes how we traceologists work. So everything starts from a site where excavation happens, and then we get an assemblage. So assemblage, as a traceologist, we have to have a proper aims and objectives, what we want to achieve by using those assemblages. So like initially I was interested in shell tools, so I will take the shell tools. And later it was stone tools, so I took the stone tools. So depending on any kind of assemblage which you prefer, you select the possible artifacts which you think can give you the answers what you are looking for. And depending on that, you can select the samples from maybe 10 to 200 or whatever. And when you select the samples, what we do a preliminary surface inspection of the artifact. We do this thing because we want to see if first thing to find if there is any kind of residues adhere to the surface. Because for the user analysis, we need to follow a protocol of cleaning process. So we cannot do this thing if there is some archaeological residue adhered to it, and we will completely then lose that information of that residue. So that's why what we do, first we do the microscopic analysis, preliminary one, and then we separate into two categories. The artifacts which are having residues, we separate them for the further analysis with other kind of techniques or microscopes, where we can understand the chemical composition or the morphological aspect of that residue. But after that, once we do that thing and we have the samples which we are only gonna analyze for the user analysis, they go through cleaning process. And this method is very important to imply, because if you don't clean the sample, you will get some misinterpretation of the users. So for the cleaning protocol also, we are having different kind of methods depending on the type of raw material we are analyzing, because the kind of chemical which I will be using maybe for the stone tool will be very harsh for a bone tool or maybe for the shell tools. So depending on the artifacts and that condition of the artifact, if it is well preserved, it's okay. But if it is in a very fragile way, you cannot do this method. So once you do this thing, then we do the microscopic analysis, and then we identify the residues and user traces and try to understand the function. But now the problem is we have the results. We are putting our hypothesis. Oh, the polish and this looks like this way, so for sure it's used for this purpose. But we need some evidence to prove that thing. So for that, we need to build an experimental protocol. So for that, we need first to collect the raw material for making the tools. So for that, we have to do the exploration of the surrounding area of the archaeological site we have excavated. And through there, we have to collect the materials as the adhesive material, or maybe wood for hafting, like that way. And also if there is some indigenous tribal groups are around who can show us the kind of activities they are doing and to replicate those things. And then such as for the stone tools, We bring the raw materials, and then we do the knapping session, because sometimes we don't understand how the stone tools are made. So with the reduction technique, we understand about that thing, and also we make the tools for our experiments. And then once we get the tools, we select the best one to perform the experiments, and then we make the mold and cast of those tools. Why we do this step? Because once you start the experiments, with each duration of time, you are gonna lose some information about the edge. So the fresh edge evidence should be there. So we make the cast, mold and cast, and we keep it for the future reference. So whatever difference we see under the microscope later in the, after using them, we can have a comparison. They got a fracture, it got an edge rounding, or it got some kind of striation on them. So all these changes will be much more understandable for us how it is occurring. And the experiments are always done in a sequential way. Sequential way means like we try to see in 5 minutes what kind of traces are happening, then maybe after 10 minutes, then 15 minutes. Then if we use for 31 hour, what is happening? It completely broke, or it lost the efficiency to work, all those kind of things. So some of the tools, even we need to have them, because sometimes we have to recreate the hunting activity. So like that way, we perform the series of experiments. And once the experiments are, like when we are doing the experiments, we record everything on an experimental form. So in that experimental form, what we do, we put all the informations about the tool, their measurements and everything, whether they were cleaned or not, we have made the mold and cast, and even what kind of action we have or the activity we have performed with that thing, because we will have number of experimental tools. Later we will get confused. So all this information should be recorded on an experimental form. And also the observation, what kind of changes were coming on the edge during the whole experimental program, to understand later, okay, after 5 minutes, nothing happened, but after 10 minutes, it broke in this particular part. So all this information you will have ready in your hand in your experimental forms. Then comes the cleaning process. But this cleaning process you can skip in the case if you are just only referring to the residue analysis to see the distribution pattern of the residue, how it is coming on the edge, then you no need to wash it. But if you are doing residue plus the user analysis, then you have to follow this cleaning protocol. And it is somewhat similar to the protocol what we use for the archaeological one. And then it again go through the microscopic analysis using different kind of microscopes and techniques. And in that way, combining the archaeological and the experimental results, having the comparison, which is giving the most closest results to that, then we construct the past activity of the site, what has happened in the site in the past. So now I gave you all the information, how we work, what happened in the past. So now the question comes, the first methodological problem is the modern day contamination and how to control them. So for me, how it started basically, it all started in Iran, in the location of Zagros mountain, where the Khorramabad valley is located. So in this valley, we discovered 4 Paleolithic, Middle and Upper Paleolithic sites. And in 2011 and 12, we did the first test excavation of these 4 sites. So among the 4 sites, these 2 sites were already excavated by Frank Hall in 1961. But still there was some information was lacking because they could not able to reach to the bedrock, and some stratigraphy disturbance was there. So that's why we re-excavated in 2011-12 test excavation. Apart from these 2, we also excavated these new sites which we discovered. And so in that way, the lithic assemblage from all the 4 sites were mostly dominated by silex. And most of the tools were in the form of points. And the preservation of the silex was very amazing. It was so fresh that it made me curious, like, can we do the functional analysis on this one? So, and another question which was intriguing me during this whole excavation period, when I gone through the literature part of Iran Paleolithic, I saw that the Iranian Zagros Paleolithic details were only giving information about the lithic technology, where they were always talking about the similarity and difference with the Aurignacian and the local technologies like Burudistian, Rusamian, and Zargian. Apart from that, or else there will be report about field survey or excavations, or trying to understand the transition between the middle and upper Paleolithic, or else the dating problem, because in this area there is a huge dating problem, because the samples are not enough sometimes, or they are not having maybe collagen like that way. So dating was a huge issue to date the sites. Or else there was environmental studies by you studying the fauna and flora of this archaeological sites of this area. Or sometimes some human remains, very few are there, but those reports are also in the articles were given. But there was a huge lack of functional analysis studies in the literature, except for few very preliminary studies by using maybe 2-3 samples, which is not sufficient for a traceological study. So after going all these things, I did the first functional analysis study as a preliminary, just like a test, whether it is applicable for these sites or no. And then we got very good results in the way of like striation, polish, and even residues on the artifacts. So apart from this very good results, we had number of modern contaminations. So these are the different kind of modern day contamination, which I recorded during my whole PhD research. And in that time, I saw the type of contaminations are like metal wear, which happens when you are excavating and then with the axe or pick and all, accidentally you touch the lithic or any kind of artifact, sorry. And then the pencil mark, it can happen while you are drawing the lithics for the publications and something like that. And then the fabrics and fibers, which goes from your cloth or something like that. And also the glue, because sometimes when the artifact is broken, we try to stick it with the glue. And also the transparent nail polish, which we use to put the numbering on the artifacts and all. And apart from that, also the modern day hairs and skin flakes of your fingers. When you are touching the artifacts with your hand, you transfer the finger skin flakes on the surface of the artifacts. And also because when we analyze the sample for the microscopic analysis, we put it on some molding clay. So it is coming direct contact with the artifacts. So then in that way, we also get the molding clay on the artifact surface. So problem with these is, if you see all these things and if you analyze with different techniques, because the molding clay, skin flakes, they come in a way under the SEM as if they are organic material. So you will think like, oh yes, maybe it is something related to use and all. So lots of misinterpretation can happen with these things. So that's why this is a huge problem in traceology. So once all these results were done, we saw the good results with user analysis and some problem with these things, but whatever, the excavation lithic assemblage also gave us such a good result. So we decided, let's do a second season of excavation, but this time selecting only one site, so that we can concentrate completely on the site properly, because with the 4 sites, it really took us a long time to finish the excavations and it was really difficult. So we just choose one site for this one. And we said, especially the director of the site said, just let's do it. Let's go for second season of excavation. So for that, we selected Kaldar Cave. Although the assemblage was less than Gilwaran Cave, Gilwaran Cave was the first site we wanted to re-excavate. But we thought, I think Kaldar will be able to give us the proper answers to the things, what the goal which we set up for the Khorramabad Valley project. So in that way, we re-excavated in the larger scale just next to the test pit. So this blue one is the new excavation which we conducted later. So because we had the experience of modern day contaminations, so just to reduce all those things, and already from the beginning, we made a point that this for this excavation, we will make a point that this excavation is traceological friendly. So we ask all the excavators to wear gloves, and all the samples which were collected, they were directly put it in the Ziploc bags, and the sticker from the outside, not from the inside, was put on the artifacts. And then they were not removed from the plastic bags until or unless they were gone through the functional analysis. So in that way, these were the control measures we took in the excavation. And even we didn't put the numbering on the stone tools, because I didn't want that unwanted nail polish or the glue traces on the stone tools. So in this excavation, we excavated 6 trenches. Out of the 6 trenches, we only excavated these 4 trenches to reach to the bedrock. The reason for this was the sediment was very hard and it was very difficult to excavate. So somehow, because the time was running out to finish the excavation, so we just excavated these 4 trenches, and then we got a very good stratigraphic layer from there. And we also collected the sample for dating method. So with the TL dating, we got the date from like 25,500 to 29,400. And with the C14 dating, the result was amazing, because the lower level of upper Paleolithic level, we got the date of 54,400 to 46,050 Cal BP, which makes this site one of the oldest in the Zagros. So with the results, we completely got excited and gone crazy. And then we said we have to publish this results. And then we published the result in scientific reports. And the dating method, what we achieved from this site, also gave us the chance to get the onset of upper Paleolithic of Zagros mountain, which is now is 40,000 to 45,250 Cal BP. Apart from this, the site also gave a very good result of early evidence of Prunus in the world, which also we published in the Comte Rendus Pellavol. So after getting all these precaution measures in the excavation, now the question comes how I will analyze the samples, because this was a part of my PhD project. I need a proper protocol to implement from the starting to skip any kind of mistake to happen for the interpretation in the later stage. So I use 4 kind of microscopes, out of which 2 are basically 3D digital microscopes, but of different models. So first I use the stereo metallurgic microscope, ZEISS, for the preliminary analysis, and also these 2 3D digital microscope for the preliminary analysis as well. Once the preliminary analysis was done for the use wear and residue analysis, I used SEM for the selective pieces to do the analysis for my samples. Because the problem with SEM is it's a very time consuming, and you need sometimes to do lots of preparation beforehand to do any kind of analysis with this microscope. So you have to cut down your samples and go only with the selective ones, which are having the best use wear and residues information on the artifact surface. And for the residue now, because, okay, these 3 microscopes give me the view of the residue, how it looks and everything. But sometimes the morphology is not that clear and you cannot understand the chemical characterization of that residue. So then I applied the multi-analytic, non-invasive multi-analytic approach, for which I use the FTIR method and microdiffraction method. So these two methods, we got the help from the scientists of ICFO from Barcelona, and also from the URV, Universitat Rovira i Virgili University Scientific Lab. So with the help of this, I identified two main type of residues. One is the bone residue and the black residue, black bituminous residue, I will say. So now the question comes, how you are going to identify a bone residue? So when the bone residue is fresh, they look something like this way, like a greasy white mass. And once they go through the burial process, the morphology completely changed, and even the color of the bone residue also, it changed. It also depends on the preservation of the bone residue on the artifacts, depending on the type of soil chemistry is. So like that way, then how you can identify them by using SEM. So when you use SEM, you get the main composition of bone in the form of phosphor and calcium, which are the main component of bone. And this is the image I have taken from the research of my colleague, Antonella Padragan. Why I have used this one? Because all the time, the bone residue, what you are getting on the tool surface should not be, or you cannot say with the 100% that it is use related. Her example I'm giving in this presentation because she got this number of kind of micro bones attached to the tool surface of like quartzite tool she was analyzing on the surface of them. And she analyzed the sample from Atapuerca Grandolina TD10 trench. And that trench is having number of broken fragments of bone. So now the question comes, it was use related or it just got adhered to the surface of the tool. So now how we are going to interpret this bone? So even to some understand or reinforce our identification of the bone residue, only with this SEM result, maybe it's not enough. So what we will do, what I did, I implemented micro diffraction method. So in that, with the collaboration with my other colleagues also, we made a reference collection in which we use the modern day bone and the archaeological bone. And then we did the micro diffraction of both of them with the aim to identify, because in the fresh bone for sure, you will get the peak for the hydroexcipitate, very huge. But because the bone, when go through the archaeological deposition, goes through some kind of degradation. So this information of hydroexcipitate will get lost, or till what limit it will reduce. So in the archaeological sample also we tried. Apart from that, we also saw like this peak of this hydroexcipitate, how it will vary with the quantity of the residue. So when we are using large quantity, the peak is coming very high. But when you are using a particle of the bone residue, the peak will be very small. But the good thing is, you always get that peak in the range between 31 to 35. And that is the range for the hydroexcipitate for the bone residue. So in that way, then I analyzed my archaeological samples, and in the archaeological samples, especially from Kaldar Cave, I got these 3 stone tools, which shows me the evidence of bone residue. So initial inspection of them with the optical microscope and 3D digital microscope, as I told you, with the color and all those things, I saw they are pale brown color, or maybe they are with some other kind of residues also, like these 2 examples. Here it is also mixed with a black residue or kind of a red residue. But if I see with the optical, because the magnification is less, I only saw the striations. So then comes the multi-analytic approach benefit. When I analyze them with SEM, I not only saw the residue, I also saw the striations on the residues. And also I saw that how those residues got stuck to the surface, because I can see clearly the fractures by using SEM. Or maybe it's not only striations, it is also having some kind of residue adhere with the user traces, which is visible with the SEM. That's why the multi-analytic approach is important. And then with the SEM, because it's having additional benefit of understanding the composition of the bone residues. So when I made the element chart of all of them, the main component of bone residue was in all 4 of them. Apart from that, because these 2 samples were having other residues also, so we also got the other element informations like manganese and iron. So in that way, now SEM is done. Now I have to do the micro X-ray diffraction for that thing. So when I did all the 4 samples, only one sample, this one, gave me the result of hydroxypitate in the residue. Why? Because if you see the previous slide, the sample size is bigger. So that's why I got the peak of hydroxypitate. And then when I refer with the experimental one also, the peak is almost like similar, because the residue size is somewhat similar to the archaeological one. So in that way, I came to know that this one is related to bone residue and possibly used for bone activities, because I also had taphonomical evidence in the Kaldar cave faunal remain, where we got these different kind of cut marks and slicing marks on the shaft of the bones, which indicates that some kind of butchery activity was done there. So now jump into my second residue, which I identified by combining this multi-analytic approach, is the black residue. So in almost, I can say like 90% of my lithic assemblages, whatever I analyzed, were having some kind of black residues on them. Maybe some kind of like this dot or some floral pattern or like this lichen kind of structures. So it made me curious what they are. Are they resins, adhesive material, or they are just some sedimental thing? And the problem with this thing is, it's not only in the Khorramabad Valley sites, it's in the many of the European and Armenian sites also, we have saw the similar kind of evidences coming on the lithic artifacts. So then the question comes, again with the collaboration with my other colleagues and everybody, we try to understand what are these black residues then. And then first we did the SEM analysis. And then in that we saw that there is some kind of manganese oxide is there in that. So there are some studies which is saying that manganese oxide stays in the sediment because of the decomposition of the organic material. But later I saw the results from Boida for the site of El Tel in Syria. And he got the similar kind of results for the black residues. And he is saying that this is maybe the precipitation of the bitumen residue. And then the same kind of black residues are also reported from the sites of Umm Cave, Israel, which is the like neighboring country archaeological sites. So then in that way, we become curious if it is really some kind of adhesive material, because they are always in the hafting area and all. So let's make a modern day reference collection of the adhesive material, which we collected in 2013 by doing the field survey around the Khorramabad Valley. And all this local material, adhesive material, are still used by the people in Khorramabad Valley. So we collected all these samples. We brought it to Tarragona. And then along with these ones, we also try to collect or make the adhesive material by combining with different kind of material, adhesive material. Because in the archaeological sites, there are a number of evidence of these kind of adhesive material used for hafting. So we did all of them. And then we first did the SEM analysis because that was the protocol we are following from the beginning of my research. So just to have a clear picture how the modern day adhesive material looks under SEM and what kind of chemical characterization they give us while analyzing them. And then in that way, we got that information. Now we need some more information to strengthen our hypothesis. Then we approached the ICFO people from Barcelona and we collaborated them for the FTIR analysis. We gave them all the modern day references and they got the graphs for all of them. So these are the modern day reference collection with the graphs. Then we gave them even the archaeological samples later. Not only my sites, even the sites from Armenia and from Spain, but for this one, because I'm only focusing on my work, so I just showing my results. So then I gave them almost 7 samples from my sites, which were, I think can possibly give me the information of the black residue because the size were bigger and like that. So then when we gave the samples, so this peaks, the carbon-carbon and carbon-oxygen bond, you will always find in all the organic materials, like here. But the only difference for the bituminous substance, you will see these kind of peaks, which you will only find in bituminous substance. So then I gone through the literature and I got the work of Munier, which she performed on Humal Cave. And she compared the bitumen, modern day bitumen with her archaeological samples. And then she got this graph. And if you compare both the graphs, you will see the exact OH bond is following similar to her. So now it raised the question for me, is it bitumen then? Bituminous substance, does it bitumen? So then in that way, I looked through the literature for more evidences. So the 2 evidences of bitumen coming from the surrounding neighboring countries is from the Umm and Humal Cave from Syria and Israel. And here they are having number of tools which were having these kind of black residues. And apart from this stone tools with black residues, they also got this small ball of oil, kind of black bituminous ball in the site of Tel. And they found the nearest source of bitumen from the site is 40 kilometers is Jebel Bicheri. And when they compare the composition of both the bitumen from this location and this archaeological black ball of bitumen, the composition was completely same. So they came to the conclusion that the stone tools were used for hafting, were using bitumen as the hafting material. So then it made me more curious and I jumped into the literature for the Iranian part. And then I saw the nearest sources of bitumen natural deposits are just in the periphery of the archaeological sites which I'm studying. And then apart from that, there is also evidence in the Neolithic time in the sites of Dehluran plain, where they use the gas chromatometric analysis, but not on the stone tools. They did the analysis on the pottery on which this black residues was there. And it, in the present day also, bitumen is still used for roofing or for waterproofing the things in Khurramabad. So then in some way, it made me convinced that maybe this bituminous substance on my archaeological sample are bitumen. So now that is the residue part. Now jump into the multi-analytic approach to understand the feasibility of the 3D digital microscope. So during my research, I did the comparison and everything, and I made this monograph, and I have to publish it. It's still going on. So I hope soon it will go for review. So just I give you a brief introduction to what is 3D digital microscope, because it is new to traceology. So for the 3D digital microscope, what I am using for my study is these two models. I already showed you before also. Apart from these two model of 3D digital microscope, especially the company of Hyrox, there is another older version, which is KH 7700. And I can say in a way, by using this microscope, University of Siena researchers are the pioneer one who started using this for doing different kind of studies, for the taphonomical studies, dental wear or use wear analysis. But the problem is they did the analysis, but the description about the microscope or how efficient it is and all those things is very brief. And the same way with the other two microscopes, which is in EPES and Musée Ohm, some of the studies have been done with that. Then again, if you go through the articles, it's always very brief. So then in that way, I want to analyze or see the feasibility of this microscope. So both the microscopes, what I use for my studies, comes with number of attachment. This is the first advantage of this microscope. It comes with number of lenses and different kind of attachment to analyze the sample depending on what kind of raw material you are using. But for my study, I only focused on this specific lens. So for both the model, the reference of the lens is different, but they functions the same. So this lens comes with a 3-range objective torrent, which you can move it. Okay. So the first low range objective of this microscopes come from the magnification of 35 to 150. And with the mid range, it comes with 140 to 1000. And the high magnification range objective comes from 700 to 5000 magnification. So what is the benefit of this thing? Because depending on the traces I'm observing, these lenses are gonna help me, which I will show you later. Apart from the magnification, this microscope also give me the benefit of playing with the light to enhance the features on the surface of the artifact, what kind of feature I want to analyze. So this ring kind of thing on the lens, by rotating it right or left, you get different kind of informations. So with the ring light, I can analyze the fractures, but some informations will be missing. So when I go to the left side and make it coaxial, so then there I will see the use wear such as the polishes, striations, etc. And the another benefit of the light source in this lens is you can play with it. You can either put it from the top to disperse the light from the top. Okay. And then with using that kind of portable light, by changing the angle from the top or from the side, you can accentuate the traces on the artifacts. So in this one, because I took it from the sideways, you see the features are much better understandable or visible. But in this one, the below one, I did it from the top ring light I use. So some of the informations are there, but it's not that clear. So traceological study, the images are very important to us, because that is the way we prove our points, that what kind of features we are seeing. So in this way, the light source helps a lot. And another good benefit of this microscope is it gives you the freedom of making tilling the panographic view of the artifact edge, which these two images I have shown in the below. So then, by using different kind of these lenses, what kind of traces I can identify. So with the low range of magnification, I can identify the fractures on the edges. And also by making the panoramic view of the tools, I can also identify the distribution of the traces on the edge and how the fractures are occurring on the edges. And with the mid-range and low range, high range, you can see different kind of striations or polishes or residues. And then with the mid-range, some of the informations will not be visible. So that can be visible with the help of high range, which you can see here. And this microscope also gives the benefit of 2D image and 3D image graphics. Because sometimes when you see the 2D images, it seems very plain, even if you know that, okay, there is some kind of height or elevation in that, but you will not completely get the picture of that thing, that why certain residues are occurring on certain part of the edge. So in that case, the 3D graphics come in handy, because then you completely understand why some of the usewares are distributed in certain part and not on the other parts. I give you the example of the few of these ones, because here, if you see, there are some kind of polish in this fracture. So you know why this polish is occurring, because it is in the, because it is on the high elevation point. In the same way, in this one also, there are some striation marks here. You see, because again, it is on the elevation part. Apart from that, you see some of the residues sometimes stuck in the topography of the artifacts, which is helpful to understand with these kind of 3D graphics. So now, because I was trying to see the feasibility of this one by using different raw materials. So first, I try to identify the traces on shell tools. So the shell tools, what I realized when I analyze the samples like pectin or this one, because they are a little bit white and very crystalline kind of material, so the disperse of the light sometimes gives little bit of trouble while analyzing the samples under 3D digital microscopes, but they are visible. The identification of the usewares, you can do it with that, but you get better images with SEM for sure. And then when I use the Mytilus, what I saw that in that one, because the material is black, it's not that glossy, the usewares are somewhat better to analyze or identify by using this raw material or this type of shell. But for the stone tools, what I saw that the benefit of 3D digital microscope, what I got in the stone tools, because it's not only giving me the detail of some of the usewares, it always also gives me some of the details of the residues adhere to it, because I can reach to the high magnification by using the high range lens in this microscope. And then obviously when we go to SEM, we characterize the residue part. And also sometimes like these kind of, another example, like where you got the residue, you get a very good colored image with the 3D digital microscope. But the problem with both the optical and the 3D digital microscope, I cannot see the fracture, which is visible with SEM, like that one. Then for the like black residue, another residue example, when you see in that way, with the same magnification or the field of view, the view which you are seeing of the sample is same. But with the SEM, I get the element details or the chemical composition of the samples. But 3D digital microscope give me again more benefit with the high magnification. So I can see in more detailing of the residue, the morphology, or if there is something else. But there is a problem with this microscope. Once you reach to 2000, the image somewhat starts to get blurry. So I can see the information, but it is not as clear as in SEM. So after doing all these things, I can do the advantage or disadvantage of this microscope for the multi-analytic analysis. So the advantage of this microscope is, yes, it gives a good magnification option to me to analyze the sample, which is like advantage over OLM. But it lacks the depth of field after the 2000 magnification. And it also gives me the better resolution of the image, which is important for a traceologist when we want to publish the articles or when we try to show in these kind of presentations. So the images are very important to us. And then the 2D and 3D graphics, which I can create, which I showed in my previous slides, and also the panoramic view of the artifacts with the complete use-where pattern, how is distributed on the overall edge. And the various kind of light sources, which already I discussed. So these are the advantages this microscope gives to me. And also it is attached to an automatic working stage. So it gives me a what do you call, advantage for the thing. I don't have to manipulate the sample for so many times. You just adjust the tool, put it below the lens, and with the automatic toy kind of something is there, you just move it right, left, and it moves the sample, and you can do the whole analysis with this microscope. And another benefit of this microscope is you don't need any kind of sample preparation for this thing, which is important for the SEM. Before analyzing, you sometimes need to put some kind of coating on the samples. Those kind of things are not necessary for this. And another very good thing is it is low maintenance. You don't need to do anything with that as for the SEM, because for SEM you need some kind of cold nitrogen and all those things to keep it working. But for this one, all those things are not necessary. And then the disadvantage of this microscope is, okay, it can identify the residues, but only till the morphological level. But after that, the chemical characterization on all those things, you need to depend on other techniques. And as I showed in my presentation with the shell tools, that when the material is very crystalline or glossy and like that way, it gives a little bit of difficulty to analyze the use-where patterns. So finally, I want to conclude all my presentation by discussing this thing, that by applying all those kind of control measures, I was able to achieve what I was looking for. Then I can say, yes, the method or the protocol I applied in our sites for excavation and in the laboratory while handling them helped me a lot to minimize the post-contaminations. And even by not marking them or not doing any kind of washing beforehand and all those things also helped me a lot to minimize the post modern day contaminations and also to understand the archaeological residues on them. But among the all modern day contamination, I was not able to eradicate the metalware because accidentally the metals touched the stone tools while doing the excavation. And when I compare both the results from the first season of excavation in Kaldar and the 2014-15 season, I have seen by applying this method, it really controlled this kind of problem in the sites and analyzing the samples. And with all this methodological analysis, I also realized that feasibility of digital microscope for the functional studies is very good. You can use it alone if you are not having the optical microscope, and but you need some kind of additional other techniques for identifying the residues. And in a way, then finally I conclude that yes, this is a very good complementary approach for analyzing the use-where and residue analysis. And for the non-invasive multi-analytic approach, by applying all this kind of multiple microscopes and techniques, it really helps to preserve the residues in situ and also helps to analyze several times with different kind of techniques. And for the multi-analytic approach, creating a reference collection of the modern day residues will help or is helping a lot to identify the archaeological residues. So in this way, I can completely say by following through a constructive protocol in the excavation laboratory and going through with the multi-analytic approach, you get a holistic answers to your questions, what you want to achieve. So in that way, I conclude my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for attending my talk. I hope you people enjoyed it. And if you people have any kind of collaboration idea, or if you want any kind of information about this traceological studies, you can contact me in this, my email ID I have provided, and also my ResearchGate link to follow my works there if you want to. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lakshmi Tumang, for such a fascinating talk. Lots of things, like as you already highlighted. I like, while I also like start. Also, I also have some queries and questions, but I also request participants to put their questions in the chat bar, so we'll take it. Like as you talk about, if you want to do the traceology, it's not only you decide on the site that while excavating, one has to decide while before excavating that you're going to do traceology. Like there's a series of protocol one has to follow, because even the minor mistakes can alter the whole results. Like having graphite on the graphite marks or pencil marks on the tool can excite you sometime, can give you some I remember we were in the class talking about gas chromatography of the samples, and there was a sample we were talking about. People were thinking that there is a kind of a human flesh on the sample, but what happened actually, some instructor had a kind of a clot, an injury which went on that tool, and it gave completely altered the whole perspective. So that's what actually it's very important. I wanted to ask one question regarding that. So we know that taphonomy is very important in traceology. What is a post-depositional process? How important, and what are the proxy or experimental proxies you can make to understand the taphonomical alteration of the tools? Like sometimes what you see, the tools might be going through multiple set of erosion and exposition. So it's not only the first time you're exposing the artifacts, it is also possible it might have exposed earlier. So how you understand those things and how you control those factors?
So for those kind of things also, basically there are a number of studies are already has been done by other researchers. Okay, so they have conducted all these kind of experimental protocols in which just imagine, means like I'm a prehistoric person and I'm taking the lithic artifacts in my bag, okay, leather bag or something like that. So then if I walk with them to a mile or something like that way, so with the abrasion, with the bag or within the lithics, what kind of traces I can identify on them. Like that, these kind of researches has happened, or even in a water barrel or some kind of thing, they have put the lithic artifacts with some kind of other kind of, what do you call this, materials, and then they roll the barrel just to recreate the past, this post-depositional use wet traces. So in that way, as I have already told you, for the traceologists, we need to make all the modern day references to conclude that thing. So like that way, already many researchers have done that thing. And in that way, now we are interpreting our archaeological samples for the taphonomical models.
And like in the comments, Dr. Neetu Agrawal is also saying like they also got a black residue in Metakheri. And I think so. Like, so that is something very interesting. Like the hafting technology is something very important. We have a very good argument. Like when it comes to the hafting lithics, like you have lots of very well diagnostic points in Africa, also in Levant and also in West Asia. But we don't see much of these stand points or these shoulder points in South Asia. But that does not decline the fact that hominins were not using. For talking about hafting, one has to also think, have we done microscopic traceological analysis to see whether there are any residues of adhesive or residues or not. Like as Neetu ma'am said, there are some black residue, and that could be bitumen. So those things, like one thing I wanted to, no, there's no. So one thing I wanted to ask, another question is like, so when you build a proxies by experimental archaeology, like suppose scraping or also seeing the use on bone or use on flesh, how you understand, like, so a tool has age and then they get discarded. how you understand the validity or utility of a tool, like how long they have been using, because that also defines the amount of residue you might get on the surface.
So
So how you talk about those things?
So that is the part I'm saying, the sequential experimental archaeology. That there you are using the sample for several times. So first you will use it for like 5 minutes, and then you will analyze under the microscope. Then when you see, okay, 5 minutes, nothing happened that much, or maybe some microfractures like that. Then you go for more like 10 minutes, then again you analyze, then again for 15, and like that way, the sequentially we do all the experiments to understand the progression of the wares, how it produce on the tool edge, and also how then to understand what efficiency level it was working, or after which it lost the efficiency. That's why I think it was discarded by the prehistoric people, like that way.
There's a small question simple question from Tosa Banta Padhan. What is the advantage of shell tools over the stone tools?
See, that will be more of the availability you are having to the raw material, access to the raw material. Because in most of the archaeological site, you are having good quality of stone tool raw material around you. So it's not necessary for these, but when you go to like coastal areas and all, when you have the abundance of raw material of shells, for sure you will use the shell tools. Then you will not look for the stone tools by that time. Are you getting the point? So like that.
No, it's important. I understand. Like I was also reading the paper, and the argument by the authors put forward from the Gibraltar and one of the sites from the Italy. It's actually sometimes what happens is the availability of the raw material plays a major role. So people might also counter argument that you have stones everywhere. They're making, but sometimes you have very thick shells and clams which have a much sharper edges.
Exactly.
And it is not it's more of opportunistic behavior. It always depends on availability of it. You don't see a regular use of it. So then there's a question from Neetu ma'am, that what if tools had multiple uses on multiple contact materials?
Oh, yeah, that's a tricky one.
Yes.
Neetu got me.
Yeah, that's a question everybody asks in a way.
Yeah. That is also one question I'm also asking myself. And I think we have to develop some protocol for that also, experimental reference collection for this also, to understand much better, because I think right now I don't have the answer for this one. Neetu, sorry.
Yeah, like completely, like in a way, I also feel like, as she said, multiple use and multiple contact materials. Only way to answer that question is a proxy building. As much as you build the proxies, you understand what kind of result you might expect on your archaeological artifacts. Another question from the Arifa: what about the tools found in the secondary context? That is something very important, because we have lots of surface sites, contact due to fluvial processes. Can we do, or can we perform user analysis on those tools? And if we can, then what are the set of limitations we should take into our mind? Like, that is what I added actually.
See, again, the same thing comes here also. You have to then again, build up an experimental program to understand whether it is possible or not with this also. So that's the only answer I can say. You have to analyze the sample. You have to see the possibility of those things and build up the experimental work to understand whether it is really possible or not. Because what I did with my archaeological samples in Khorramabad Valley, it is not like, okay, what? I analyzed them, then I got the answers, whether it is possible or not. So first thing is you have to start. You have to do.
Yeah, completely. Like it's a something very important. Like as you mentioned, like we have lots of surface sites, but what is the more enigmatic part about surface sites? We do not know what these artifacts has been facing, how long they have been on the surface, and what are the, like there was an interesting case about how trampling put the impression on artifacts, and how we see, as you talked about, while hitting a pickaxe on artifact, you see this occurrence of this point of percussion. which we might take it into consideration, but it's a post-deposition alteration, nothing to do with the hominin behavior itself.
Yeah.
So those things, it's all about experimental and practicing it, like you see.
Because I give you an example, because one of my colleague in my department, Lena Asaryan, she did with these kind of trampling effects after the tool use. So because what she did, she took the stone tool samples into a wildlife sanctuary kind of place where lots of bears are there. Okay. And she kept the stone tools accordingly. And then they just left it. And they said, okay, let the bears come and we will see how it is happening. So then the bear came, they walked over it, this and that. And during the whole experiment, what they saw, that the tool is not only where they kept, got misplaced, even because of trampling and walking of the bears, it got some kind of additional usewares on it. So in that way, still that experiment, she's doing is still continuing. So we are still waiting for the results about that thing. But it's a very interesting one to see, like this way, to reconstruct the experimental protocols with different kind of ways.
There is another question, but I think so you already talked about it. Apart from, okay. Another question from Dr. Neetu Agrawal. Apart from bone and black residue, which we think it could be bitumen, and what are the other possible set of residue you might find on artifacts, like to think of getting on?
Yeah, basically, I didn't conclude it. One, I'll show you in my book. I don't know if it is visible or not. Can you see this one?
Yes, yes. Yes, in the middle one, yeah.
Also, basically some kind of black residue. I got it on my stone tools. So when you observe under the SEM, it's again is like organic material.
Yeah, it's
so it is like a chain. This one is basically like a chain for oval residue. So we were like, oh, it's an organic thing. What it is, kind of. Then later, when we analyze this, basically it is some kind of, what was this? Soil fungi. So basically it's more like a post-depositional. It's not use related. But it was an interesting find because it shows apart from the use related residue, you can also find these kind of, and somewhat this one also is very nice residue, I can say, because they also help in the paleo environment reconstruction and all.
There's a question from Saurav Dasgupta. Can we perform different sort of user analysis on set of assemblage in order to know multiple contact material, like performing phytolith based user analysis or as well as protein based on conducting? I believe Saurav, are you getting the question, Rashmiti? Like
different sort of analysis.
So it's asking like, do we have any variation in terms of methodology depends on different contact materials?
Yes, because see, that's the thing. What we people are doing the experiment is not only the specific type of raw material, contact material, I can say. Means the material which we work is called contact material. Okay. So the contact material can vary. You as a traceologist, you have to decide about that thing. Because I give the example from my side. Like in my side, I said that there is the earliest evidence of Prunus. So it shows when something is, again, the same kind of thing. When something is in abundance, you are gonna use that. So I will choose exactly the same kind of raw material what I'm getting in the surrounding area. So I use the Prunus species for doing the woodworking, which will give a different kind of use-ware traces than what I will conduct on the oak tree or on the people tree or like these kind of things. So these variations you will find with using different kind of contact material. Even for, if I'm saying I'm doing on bone. So it is a bone of deer, it is a bone of rabbit, it's a bone of, I don't know, chicken. So what kind of variation you will see, you have to do according to the different contact material you are using for to perform the experiments.
There's another question from Tess Falconet. Are you able to say whether the residue found on the was found was from contact due to use or because of taphonomic reasons?
See, that's the thing I'm saying. When that's why I gave the example of that Atapuerca one done by my colleague, because what she was presenting, the residue was adhere to it. Okay, but in my samples, 2 of them, it's not only the bone residue, it was also having the striations on them. So when you have the two of the main thing together, it indicates that it was used for some kind of function. But if you only get the residue and you don't get any kind of use wear traces around the residue, for sure, then it is maybe taphonomical thing. Later got adhere to the surface like that.
We'll take a last question because, as we know, like time is because of time restrictions. Last question is from again Dr. Neetu Agrawal. In terms of microfractures, how would you distinguish from the non-use damages?
Yeah, again, this one you have to do the experiment. The non-use one, with if I'm saying for the archaeological one, it will be difficult. Like we are already discussing about the trampling and rolling down.
Lots of processes.
So that is little bit tricky question, and still a number of studies basically still going on that thing. And I myself want to do this experiment basically, and not more for the stone tools, for the shell tools, because the post-depositional alteration is not done yet till now for the shell tools. So somewhat for stone tools, yes, but not for shell tools.
For me, like I'll take a last question from my side only. I always want to ask. So we have a huge. I was also talking with this regard with also my other colleagues that we have this huge bias that we see tools and we have bias like hand axe has to be the portion which is used in hand axe is the tip part. The cleaver which has a broader cleaving edge. Are you able to define that what is a utility part of the artifacts when you do the traceological analysis?
Because now again we go to the evidence from our sites only, or the Zagros paleolithic sites. So I showed you that we are having number of tools in the form of points. So what first goes in our mind? Points, projectiles, used as bow and arrow, spear head and all those things. But when I did the analysis, it was not used as projectiles. Some of them were used for cutting and scraping like knife, so like that kind of thing. So, and this is the benefit of traceology. Until or unless you don't put it into use, analyze the samples properly, you will not get the whole picture of what is happening. So this is the what we traceologists reinforcing and convincing people to go with these kind of studies, and always make a point that to keep somebody as your traceologist team member in the excavation, so that control the things from the very beginning, not to do any kind of this funny business later. So like that.
So with this fascinating talk, I have like questions jumping in or popping out in my brain, but I see like the time is a restriction we all have. First of all, from the behalf of Paleotalks team, I would like to thank our speaker for such a fascinating talk, an informative talk. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it was more of a method-oriented talk rather than a case-oriented talk. And understanding by seeing the components and the intricacies of this method, first thing we understand how significant it is. And it is always important to have multiple proxies to understand hominin behavior. And sometimes what we are assuming in our brain might be wrong, or it might be restricting our information in a way. So that's where the multiple proxies and multiple ways and multiple analysis comes in the picture. So one has to be the multi-analytical in terms of approach and perspective. And I believe we hope to see multiple traceological based projects in upcoming time in South Asia, like what Dr. Neetu Agrawal was saying, using it for meta-carry, and we might see multiple sites. And we, of course, we get to see multiple kind of, because I remember nowadays we have anywhere we see the application of traceology, we see that it's a completely change of horizon. Like some of the sites in France, where they were doing the basic traceological screening and they got to know about the thread and the cordage and the kind of textile. And nobody was expecting like getting a textile or cordage kind of thing from an archaeological context or paleolithic context. So that's how important it is. I again thank our speaker for joining us. It's an honor for having you with us. And again, apart from that, I would like to thank our participant to being with us, sticking with us and listening us. And of course, we are looking forward to seeing you again and again with upcoming Paleo Talk session. With that, I would also like to announce our upcoming session on next Sunday, which is something very interesting and very, very crucial. Now from the method oriented to getting into the theoretical part of or conceptual part of the paleo research. The session's title is The Hominins and Humans, the understanding the process of becoming human. So the session is going to talk about the behavioral evolution or how we talk about behavioral modernity. The speaker of the session is Dr. Mark Kissel from Appalachian State University, USA. And he's going to talk about what exactly is a behavioral modernity means and how different conceptual framework altered this whole perception and how different set of authors have been using it in different perceptions. I hope to see you all over there. We will put the further information as soon as possible, probably by the mid of the upcoming week. And thanking you everyone. And I wish everybody is doing good, doing well in this whole circumstance of pandemic. We are receiving lots of compliments. And of course, I also say like, it's a wonderful session what we had today. And with that, I formally close the session and hope to see you all in upcoming sessions of Paleo Talks. Namaskar.
Thank you so much, everybody. Bye.